Next on Animator Talk, Walt's idea for his next feature came from a favorite book of his daughter's. That's right, we're discussing how Walt tackled Winnie the Pooh, coming up. Hey animation fans, Animator Talk here to celebrate the art of animation and its contribution to entertainment of yesterday, today, and into the future. Are you an animation enthusiast? Perhaps you see certain qualities in your favorite animated movie that your friends might overlook. Well, then this channel is perfect for you. I ask that you consider subscribing to this channel. Maybe give this video a thumbs up and tell your friends about this channel so we can build this community together. The time period is the early 1960s. Walt had very little to do with the animation studio at this time. Sure, he would check in now and then, but most of his perusing of the animation offices was late at night when everyone went home. He would go through drawings and sift through trash baskets just to see how his men were doing. The animators felt a great disconnect from Walt at this time.
Surprise!
He got into live-action films, television, his very own theme park, and he purchased 27,000 acres of swamp and land in Florida for his next theme park project. The studio had its latest disappointment in The Sword and the Stone. It underperformed at the box office, and critics hardly had a good thing to say about the film. Walt had his department up to their elbows in assignments for their next feature, The Jungle Book. It was a massive picture. Walt tried hard to keep animators and writers away from the original source material and devise a story roughly based. It was a heavy film. Walt felt the team needed a distraction, but with what? Years earlier, when his daughters were very young, Walt overheard his daughter Diane giggling at something in her bedroom. He popped in to see what was so funny. She showed him a copy of a book, When We Were Very Young. It was a story about Winnie the Pooh by A. Milne. This story was new to Walt, and he had attempted getting the screen rights to these stories, but with some resistance. Walt would later obtain the screen rights by 1961. And he was ready to go by 1964. Now, as I said, the stories of Winnie the Pooh were written by A. Milne. He wrote these stories for his son, Christopher Robin, as a way of lulling him to sleep at night. Using inspiration from the many stuffed animals in his bedroom, especially around Christopher Robin's favorite stuffed bear that his father had given to him for his first birthday. The bear was named after a zoo bear, Winnipeg, and a swan named Pooh. These stories filled several books which were published between 1924 and 1927 and proved very popular within the English market. Early one morning in 1964, Walt called a story meeting, telling his staff that Winnie the Pooh was his next plan for a feature animated film. The team sketched and devised how to best begin production. It was during this meeting that Walt decided it best to make this a featurette rather than a full-length animated film. While these books were very popular in Britain, the American public needed to be introduced to these characters. It was decided to tell the story from the first two chapters of the book, then they would follow up with other stories with other featurettes. Wooly Reitherman was charged with directing the film. It was Walt's hope that Wooly would infuse some good American humor in these stories. After all, if the American public is going to embrace Pooh, humor was the best way to do it. It was also decided it would be best to treat these tales just as presented, as a book. The scenes would play out within an open book, with a narrator walking you through the stories. To make it even more fun, the characters would interact with the book, jumping from one illustration to another, interacting with the text on the page. And not only could they hear the narrator, they would break the fourth wall and respond to him from time to time. I always found it kind of fun that the text on the page was often written to coincide with the dialogue being performed on the screen. Production on The Jungle Book was in full swing at this time, which tied up many of the 9 old men. Only John Lounsbury and Eric Larson were available and assigned to animate these characters, with a talented group of animators. When coming up with character designs, the animators wanted to honor the E.H. Shepard illustrations from the books as best they could. However, while those illustrations work terrifically in a storybook illustration, they're not great for animation. An animator needs to be able to see the character from all angles and animate in kind. It meant a complete overhaul of the character designs. Pooh Bear was rounded out, made more plump, and had more contour lines to his head and his face. The red shirt was actually not an addition from the Disney studio. It was added in the 1930s for merchandising purposes, and it stayed. Eeyore was fleshed out to have more floppy characteristics. He's a character who's filled with sawdust, so they animated him with almost sack-like limbs, and was animated to show a lot of weight. Kanga and Roo were rounded out as well. It was important to give them a three-dimensional feel to help the animators move them around. That and definite seams in their construction, so you never forgot that they were stuffed animals stitched together, and to differentiate them from the live animals that they interacted with in the 100-Acre Wood. The rest of the cast remained live animals from the forest. Rabbit was designed a little taller than the cast. He was a nervous sort, so he would be animated with a twitchy nose and ears to show that he was becoming overwhelmed. Owl was an amalgam of animated owls from the past. He shared characteristics from the owls from Sleeping Beauty and Sword in the Stone, but taller, and would stand out with his chest up in the air to show his pompous attitude and his know-it-all nature.
What are you supposed to be?
I'm a little black rain cloud, of course.
Silly old bear.
The character of Christopher Robin would be designed like most traditional characters in the Disney library. They kept his design similar to E.H. Shepard's, but they needed to change his clothes and his hair to reflect the American boy's wardrobe. Rotoscoping was utilized on occasion to keep his movements natural looking. When voice casting for the role of Pooh, the studio turned to a studio favorite, Sterling Holloway. He had been cast in many other roles for the studio, such as the Stork in Dumbo and the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland, and the Python Ka in the upcoming Jungle Book. He had this soft, reedy voice that had such an innocence to it as he understated his lines.
Oh, bother. I think I shall come down.
Junius Matthews was another actor well known to the studio. After playing the owl in Sword in the Stone, he would voice Rabbit in this tale.
Hello, Rabbit. Oh, hello, Pooh Bear. Pooh Bear? What a pleasant surprise.
Hal Smith, of Andy Griffith fame, would provide the voice of Owl.
You, sir, are stuck. A wedged bear in a great tightness. In a word, irremovable. Now,
Barbara Luddy would provide the voice of Kanga. She previously voiced Lady from Lady and the Tramp and Merryweather the Boisterous Fairy from Sleeping Beauty. Playing her son Roo was none other than Clint Howard. Yes, that Clint Howard, the brother of director Ron Howard. The role of Christopher Robin would be played by Wooly Reitherman's son, Bruce. And Disney storyman Ralph Wright would provide the low baritone of Eeyore.
Days, weeks, months, who knows?
When it came to music, Walt turned to two brothers, Robert and Richard Sherman. They had just completed the laborious task of providing a terrific list of songs for the soundtrack of Mary Poppins. Walt knew they wouldn't let him down on this featurette. Walt never allowed superfluous songs into his productions. Any song in any one of his features had to move the story along, not slow it down. It was Walt's thought that this featurette needed to begin with an introductory theme song.
Deep in the 100-acre wood, where...
The Sherman Brothers got right to work at the piano. They would end up writing 4 songs for this featurette. The theme song,
Winnie the Pooh, Winnie the Pooh, tubby little tubby.
Up, Down, and Touch the Ground,
When I up, down, touch the ground, it puts me in the mood.
which shows the exercise routine is more about building an appetite rather than losing weight.
For food.
Rumbly in My Tumbly,
Hum-dum-dee-dum, hum-dum-dee-dum, I'm so rumbly in my tumbly.
and A Little Black Rain Cloud would round out the soundtrack.
I'm just a little black rain cloud hovering.
One of Walt's favorite composers, Buddy Baker, would be the composer of this score. He was inspired by Sergei Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf. Within that production, each of the characters was represented by a different musical instrument. He decided that was a great way to musically introduce each character for this featurette. Eeyore was welcomed into frame by a bass clarinet. And a flute would represent Kanga and a piccolo for Roo. A regular clarinet would represent Rabbit. The oboe would represent Piglet. Winnie the Pooh was represented by a baritone horn. Now, speaking of Gopher, the American audience would take to Gopher just fine, but the British audience, they didn't care for him in the least.
Somebody call for an excavation expert?
Because Piglet was not featured in Winnie the Pooh and the Honey Tree, it was thought that Walt was replacing Piglet with Gopher. Now, as I said once before, Gopher was the American representative in the 100-Acre Wood. He was not in the books.
I'm not in the book, but I'm at your service. The Gophers. The name is McCard.
That running gag has more adults laughing than the kids.
After all, he's not in the book, you know.
Oh.
Winnie the Pooh and the Honey Tree was released on February 4th of 1966 as a double feature with The Ugly Dachshund. The American critics very much enjoyed this featurette, calling it clever and inventive. The songs and humor in the writing were applauded in the papers. However, on the other side of the pond, the British didn't care for this adaptation, claiming it was too Americanized and lacked the warmth of A.A. Milne's books. Then they blasted the Walt Disney Company for omitting Piglet and replacing him with the Gopher. They wouldn't see Piglet until Winnie the Pooh and the Blustery Day, released in 1968. Walt got right to work on the follow-up to Winnie the Pooh and the Honey Tree. He was eager to get his story team to introduce Tigger to an American audience. He just knew he had a hit with the Winnie the Pooh stories, and Pooh would be a big contributor to the Disney animation. How right he would be, but unfortunately, he wouldn't live to see it. Walt passed away that December. Winnie the Pooh and the Blustery Day would be released 2 years later, followed by Winnie the Pooh and Tigger 2 in 1974. On March 11th of 1977, the studio would combine all three into a feature-length film as always intended. They would call it The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. The studio animated a small segment as an epilogue at the end. It was a scene where Christopher Robin would have a heart-to-heart with Pooh on growing up and how he was expected to do just that by going to school. It was a heartwarming end cap to finish the film, as Christopher Robin says goodbye to his friend and his childhood days. Until next time, you keep moving forward.